Tonight, a provocative visit. A planned meeting between Taiwan's president and the Speaker of the House, igniting a diplomatic firestorm with China. Plus, a new homicide investigation after video shows guards walking away during a fire that killed nearly 40 migrants. Mexico investigating the incident at a migrant center for murder. And everything in moderation. Why even good-for-you superfoods can be toxic.
You can get yourself into trouble and have no idea.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. A world leader's visit to America ups the ante of Chinese rhetoric. Welcome to Faith Nation from the CBN studio in Washington. I'm Caitlin Burke. Taiwan's president is on a multi-day tour of the United States, and China isn't happy about it. The communist regime says they're closely watching what happens here as the Taiwanese president looks to thank allies in the West for their support. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka has more on the trip. Matt?
Well, Caitlin, tensions with China have put new pressure on the U.S. visit from Taiwan's president. China is vowing to respond to any high-level meetings, while the U.S. is urging Beijing not to overreact. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen arrived to fanfare from Taiwan independence supporters in New York City on Wednesday. The trip is meant as a thank you to supporters of the democratic island while it's facing growing threats from China over independence. She told guests that a united Taiwan is a safer Taiwan, and a safer Taiwan means a safer world. Taiwan's president is planning to meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California next week. McCarthy did not address the meeting directly at a news conference on Thursday, but did call out authoritarian regimes around the world.
Putin's authoritarian, President Xi's authoritarian. I'm very concerned where I see the world right now. It looks like 1936. We got China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
Pro-China protesters also greeted the Taiwanese president. China claims Taiwan as part of its own territory, with Beijing saying they're closely monitoring the visit and promising to, quote, fight back if the meeting with McCarthy happens. McCarthy had expressed interest in visiting Tsai in Taiwan. Other members of Congress have already visited the self-governing island this year. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is downplaying the significance of the trip, carefully calling it a transit visit.
It is Taiwan's decision to make these transits based on their own travel. Transits are not visits. They are private and they're unofficial. I would also remind everyone that this is not new. Every Taiwan president has transited the United States. President Tsai Ing-wen herself has transited the U.S. 6 times since taking office in 2016.
The administration is also trying to preempt any aggression from China, as they've stressed their diplomatic position hasn't changed.
The U.S. opposes any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side, and we do not support Taiwan independence, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means.
Of course, the lingering question is what kind of response may come from China. When former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited the Taiwan mainland last year, China responded with aggressive military drills around the island. Caitlin?
Thanks, Matt. A Wall Street Journal reporter is being detained in Russia on espionage charges. Russia's Federal Security Service accusing Evan Gerskovich of collecting state secrets about the Russian military, an allegation the Wall Street Journal denies. The Moscow-based correspondent was arrested Wednesday. The White House has since been in contact with the Russian government, condemning Moscow's, quote, continued targeting and repression of journalists and freedom of the press. Joining us now is author, columnist, and speaker Gordon Chang. Gordon, first of all, focusing on China, why is this planned meeting in California between the House Speaker and the President of Taiwan such a big deal? Is China making too much of it?
Well, China always makes too much of it. And we have heard threats from China before when speakers of the House and others have gone to Taiwan. And most of the time, China does not follow through. It's kabuki. But Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has actually been showing utter disrespect for the U.S. recently, and he's been much more aggressive. So maybe this is the time where Beijing actually does, in fact, follow through. But the United States can't back down, because once you start to back down, things get worse. Speaker McCarthy was going to meet Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan. Apparently, he was persuaded not to do that. So the Chinese are still making threats. At some point, we just got to say enough.
The official U.S. position on Taiwan is that it does not support Taiwan's independence, but rather Taiwan's self-defense capability. Do you think China views that as a contradictory message?
In a sense, it is a contradictory message, and it shows the failure of American resolve. I don't think China would invade Taiwan if the United States were clear. If we clearly said that we will use military force to oppose a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, then I believe that Beijing would huff and puff, but they wouldn't want to take us on, because even if they thought they could win, the casualties would be too high and the consequences for China would be too great. Unfortunately, we don't have a national security establishment in Washington that understands that times have changed and we need to have tougher tactics.
You recently tweeted that China's leaders keep saying they're getting ready to go to war, but, quote, smart people keep on saying, oh, they don't really mean that. How serious is Beijing's threat?
They're getting more serious, but the most important thing, Caitlin, is that China is in fact preparing for war. They not only talk about war, Xi Jinping appointed what's called the War Cabinet in October, is engaged in the fastest military buildup anywhere since the Second World War, and he's mobilizing China's civilians for war. So he's getting ready to strike, and the United States is being oblivious.
Switching gears, Gordon, to another adversary, Russia. As we just mentioned, they've detained another American, this time a journalist. Would you say Americans are safe in Russia?
No American is safe in Russia, and no American should be in Russia. And the United States should, as we've done recently, tell Americans to leave. And we should be reducing our dependence and non-essential personnel at our diplomatic outposts. The Biden administration, when it negotiated for Brittany Griner's release, was just paving the way for the taking of another hostage, which is what's occurred right now. And this is on a downward spiral for a lot of reasons. But once you start negotiating for hostages, it just never ends.
All right, Gordon Chang, we appreciate your insights as always.
Thank you, Caitlin.
In Mexico, 40 migrants are dead after a fire at an immigration detention center on the southern border. The blaze now being investigated as a possible homicide. Security video shows guards walking past trapped detainees, making no apparent attempt to save them as smoke filled the space. Mexico's president says the fire was started by migrants who had just found out they would be deported. But authorities are investigating 2 federal agents, a state migration officer, and 5 members of a private security firm for homicide due to their lack of a response. The detention center is in Ciudad Juarez, one of the busiest border crossings for those entering the U.S. 225,000 migrants were apprehended by Border Patrol agents in the area between October 2022 and February of this year. From the surge at the southern border to a new crisis unfolding up north. More migrants are entering the U.S. through Canada. And with already strained resources, northern states are now demanding more federal assistance or permission to defend the border themselves.
New Hampshire's not waiting for the crisis to cause further impact to our state.
At a recent Homeland Security Committee hearing, Robert Quinn, commissioner of the New Hampshire Department of Safety, told lawmakers his state's troopers are ready and able to step in to help support border security.
From our perspective, it's critical that Homeland Security delegate its authority to our state police to detain and apprehend those who are crossing the border illegally into our state.
To date, the Biden administration has rejected the state's requests. New Hampshire is part of the Swanton sector of the northern border, which also includes parts of Vermont and New York. That sector alone has experienced a nearly 850% increase in migrant crossings over the last year. Many of its Border Patrol agents diverted to the south.
There are now fewer than 2,000 Border Patrol agents to cover the 3,145-mile land border, more than twice the size of the southwest border in terms of geography.
Homeland Security experts say much of the movement at the northern border is being driven by Mexican cartels and other criminal organizations.
If the northern border is now being exploited by these cartels, and by international players like China, because they're the largest exporter of fentanyl into our country. They use the cartels as well. Then we have a big problem.
Donnell Harvin, former D.C. chief of Homeland Security, says an unsecured northern border also makes the U.S. susceptible to terrorism.
Well, it's historically been a concern, particularly with Islamists and Islamic terrorists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda coming from the southern border. If that becomes a reality, or even a possibility of the northern border, then we have things other than human trafficking and drug trafficking to worry about. But we have terrorists coming in through the northern border and that we're not aware of.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection says it's assigned an additional 25 agents to the northern border to help with the current surge. A majority of the agency's resources still tied up in the south. Coming up, mid-air collision. Details behind the deadly disaster involving 2 Army Black Hawk helicopters. An investigation is underway into what caused a crash between 2 Army Black Hawk helicopters in Kentucky. The accident late Wednesday night killed all 9 U.S. service members aboard. Governor Andy Beshear says it's a tough day for his state, Fort Campbell, and the 101st Airborne.
Blessed to live in the freest country in the history of planet Earth. But we must remember that that freedom relies on those who are willing to serve, some of which pay the ultimate price. We're going to let them know that they are loved, they are special. And if they'll allow us to carry some of their grief, we'll do that for as long as we can.
The governor went on to say all those who lost their lives are children to God and is calling for prayers for all affected. Moving on to the economy, new jobless claims are on the rise. That according to new data from the Labor Department. Still, overall unemployment applications remain historically low, despite the Fed's efforts to raise interest rates and lower inflation. 198,000 people sought new jobless benefits last week, up 7,000 from the week prior, and a 3-week high. The Federal Reserve now predicting a rise in overall unemployment from the current 3.6% to 4.5% by the end of the year. Joining us now is Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate. Mark, I've got a lot of questions for you today, so I hope you're ready.
Absolutely. Good to be with you.
First off, the job market seems to be holding up, which seems to be bad news for inflation. Why is that?
The Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Jerome Powell, of course, has been raising interest rates for more than a year now. And time again, Chairman Powell would point to the mismatch between the supply and demand of workers. So we'll get an update next week on the job openings and labor turnover survey on the number of job openings in the country. But that number most recently had remained quite elevated at nearly 11 million, 10.8 million at last count. And yet the number of unemployed has been roughly around 6 million. So you can see where there still has been a lot of demand for workers, and yet the labor supply has not yet gone back to pre-pandemic levels. That's a complicated issue. So the Fed has feared that could contribute to a so-called wage price spiral where workers essentially demand higher wages. And we've seen some of that with some of the union movements around the country, not to mention what workers might be seeking to command as they change jobs. But I think, of course, the emergence of the banking crisis around the country has changed that dynamic in terms of what the Fed is focused on at the moment.
We saw retail sales surge in January. Does that say anything significant about where inflation is going?
Not necessarily, Caitlin. We had a pretty lumpy holiday shopping season in the sense it was off to the races in October, and then November and December were sort of just so-so. And we can think about the fact that inflation's been raging for quite some time now. That's forced consumers to essentially drain their so-called excess savings, the savings that was accumulated during the pandemic when either people opted not to spend or in some ways just simply couldn't. And we think that some of that savings still exists, but our own Bankrate surveys have indicated that, for example, there's more than a third of Americans who have more credit card debt than emergency savings. And those emergency savings that we define as being able to pay for an emergency expense of $1,000 or more from savings, that's being drawn down as well, where only 43% of Americans say they essentially have that money in the bank. So the good news here, back to your first question, is the job market may help to sustain some of this consumer spending, but consumers may also be thinking it's time to be more cautious with the sort of cloudiness with respect to the economic outlook that we now see. The fear is that banks will draw back on their lending, and that alone may tighten credit conditions around the country and do some of the Federal Reserve's job for it.
Would you say we should expect high prices to stick around for a while? And what's your best guess about the Federal Reserve's next move?
Well, inflation's a little like along the themes of what I think the great Benjamin Franklin once said, that fish and visitors stink after 3 days. Inflation's been stinking for months now, and so it's already stuck around. The real question is, how long will it remain unacceptably high? And I think the Federal Reserve, which is essentially the main cop on the beat of trying to battle inflation, just like all the other central banks around the world, which, by the way, have continued to raise interest rates recently in the face of this systemic risk that they're seeing in the banking system. The Fed thinks that they may be able to get by with just one more rate increase. That would come at the beginning of May. And there are a lot of deflationary forces at work in the economy now. We'll just have to see how all that plays out. I think that maybe in the second half of the year, we'll see some better news on inflation. And it's been trending in that direction.
Speaking of the second half of the year, some economists forecast that's when we will enter a recession. What's your take on that? You know we can't have you on without asking if we're going to end up in a recession.
I'll have a better answer for you about this next week, but let me tell you what I can tell you about that right now, and that is we survey economists all the time at Bankrate, once a quarter, at least on this question alone. And over the previous two surveys, let's say going back over the last 8 months, each time, the collective wisdom of those economists have been that the chances of a recession in the coming 12 months or so were about even, meaning maybe, maybe not, but definitely a heightened risk. We're just in that process of completing that quarterly survey right now, and I can tell you just looking at the data without getting it all compiled as yet, because it's in process, we're absolutely seeing them believe that there is a greater chance of a recession happening between now and the end of the year than not. So this latest experience with the banking system has definitely raised those odds of a recession occurring. But I would argue quickly, Caitlin, that the recession need not be as severe as the previous two we experienced when unemployment peaked in 2010 and 2020.
All right. Well, Mark, we'll be looking forward to those results. We appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.
Superfoods turn toxic. Why too much of a good thing could be bad. Next. Welcome back. Everything in moderation is a popular refrain when it comes to eating healthy, but it shouldn't just apply to junk food or sweets. As medical reporter Lori Johnson explains, the same approach should be taken with some popular superfoods.
If a food is good for you, then eating more of it is even better, right? Not necessarily. In some cases, too much of a good thing can become bad.
You can get yourself into trouble and have no idea, so it carries on for a long time because you would never suspect your favorite great food.
Some so-called superfoods like spinach, chia seeds, beets, and raspberries are high in oxalate. That's an often harmless chemical compound that for some people proves problematic if eaten in large amounts.
Now the fashions are these foods that are high in oxalate are very popular and promoted as good for us, so it's really easy to overdo it.
Other foods to watch for are quinoa, beans, and almonds because they're often consumed in large amounts, especially in gluten-free or dairy-free diets.
The almond milk and the almond flour, the almonds are thrown into every trail bar and trail mix and new version of granola and snacks everywhere and desserts. Almonds are a big problem because they're being adopted at a rate and being eaten at a rate that's never been done before.
Oxalate can attach to the minerals in our body and prevent these important nutrients from being absorbed. One example is calcium, which is necessary for strong bones. A calcium deficiency could lead to developing brittle bones, also known as osteoporosis.
And with men, it's particularly fatal. It seems to be that men break a bone, they're more likely to have that end up shortening their lives significantly.
Eating a lot of these high oxalate foods can also be tied to the formation of kidney stones.
Any kind of urinary tract problems are classic oxalate problems.
For years, nutritionist Sally Norton wondered why she suffered from foot pain, sleep problems, and arthritis. During the same time, she ate a lot of potatoes and Swiss chard. When she stopped eating those high oxalate foods, those health problems also stopped.
This really shocked me because I'm supposed to know how to be healthy, and I didn't.
She says others suffering from unexplained physical or mental health problems might want to examine whether they too could be eating too much of a good thing.
Oxalates are classically known to start harming digestion over time, where you start having digestive issues that can look like stomach problems or reflux. It can look like swallowing problems, or more commonly, things like irritable bowel syndrome.
So if you're someone who eats a lot of your favorite superfood, if it's high in oxalate, it might be wise to back off a little. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Finally tonight, a reminder of God's presence in the midst of tragedy. As the Nashville community comes together to honor and grieve the 6 lives lost in this week's school shooting, Tennessee Governor Bill Lee is sharing his own feelings of pain and a desperate desire for answers, but not without a message of hope.
There is hope in the midst of great tragedy because God is a redeemer. What is meant for evil can be turned for good. May we grieve in the days ahead, but not without hope.
The governor says while prayer is the first thing we should do, it's not the only thing, and that the work of law enforcement and educators to strengthen school safety is not in vain. Joining the governor and just praying for peace that passes understanding for those families. That's it for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.